Hello, and welcome back to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems. We've covered a lot of ground very quickly in the last module, so your head may be spinning. I hope you're still with me, at least kind of. That's okay. It's supposed to be an overview. You're not supposed to be an expert in dynamical systems theory by now. So because everything went so fast, let's quickly take a deep breath and look back at what we've covered so far. So we started the lecture by telling you about different perspectives in science. And what we're going to do here in this lecture was going to present a sort of a specific alternative process-based perspective of the organism and its evolution. And I started very abstractly, philosophically, by talking about real systems being patterned processes and how we can represent them using formal systems that are models, and how the accuracy of this representation was not the main thing, that we're using these models as tools to sort of answer specific questions we have about the actual systems. I was introducing networks, network graphs as a specific type of formal model that we can use to address specific questions. They are abstracted from the underlying regulatory processes and give us topological explanations of, for example, the robustness, resilience, or anti-fragility of a network. But mechanisms are what explains the actual causal structure of the regulatory processes underneath. And network graphs, remember, they do not do this. So this is what I mean when I say networks are not organisms, or better, organisms are not networks, okay? So networks do not provide mechanistic explanations, and we need dynamical models for those explanations. Dynamical models allow us to put the system together again once we've decomposed it into its components and localized specific functions to those components. Dynamical systems theory provides powerful tools for studying mechanisms as processes, but by themselves, the models we saw in the last module do not provide mechanistic explanations either. In fact, at the end, I tried to convince you that the explanations they provide are just the same as you get from global network analysis. They're topological explanations in the sense that they allow you to classify different processes according to different qualitative behaviors, different topologies of their phase space. This is all you need to remember about that last module, more or less. Okay, so what we want to do in this module is come back to this question of, what a mechanism is and how it connects to what we said before. And at the very core of the idea of a mechanism is the fact that it's supposed to be a causal explanation. It's supposed to reveal something about the causal structure of the world, maybe, but even if you don't take mechanisms in this sort of ontological way, you still have to say that they are trying to explain in terms of causes. I said it before, dynamical systems on their own do not provide causal explanations. So how do we connect the two? We have diverged, but we haven't reconnected these two branches of the lecture. So let's talk about causality today. And in the first lecture of this module, I'm going to give you a very quick tour of the philosophy of causation. And it starts, as so many things in philosophy, with Aristotle and his famous four causes. You probably heard about Aristotle's causes before. I'm going to quickly go over them using this example of a beautiful cat made by Alberto Giacometti. It's a sculpture made of bronze. And so Aristotle's theory of the four causes is about the kind of questions you can ask about this cat. Okay, so Aristotle says there are four types of questions, four types of explanations of the cat. The first is what he calls a material cause, or hylen, what the statue is made of. In this case, it's a bronze statue. So the bronze is the material cause of the cat. The second cause is the formal cause, eidos, a very sort of difficult concept in many circumstances, but here it's quite easy. What is it to be that statue? Its shape, its catness, it's being a cat, or representing a simulacrum of a cat. Efficient cause. Okay, so that's sort of the answer to the question, what generated the statue? And in this case, it's Alberto Giacometti sculpting the sculpture in Paris. So it's a process, okay? Efficient causes are very important. And the last type of cause that Aristotle introduced got him into a lot of trouble later on. It's the final cause, or telos. And that is the answer to the question, what is the purpose of the statue? It is art. It is supposed to be a piece of art. It was intended by the artist to be a piece of art. Now, what got Aristotle into trouble is this sort of idea with the telos, that something, the aim, the intention of something that lies sort of in the future can cause something in the past. But that is sort of mistaking what Aristotle meant by these four causes. He doesn't mean causes like we think about causation in modern times. This is more restricted. We only think of a cause as something like the efficient cause, number 3 in this list. But what Aristotle really is after here is are different forms of explanation. So he's really telling us something about causes, answers to these specific questions that I was raising above. They represent different ways to explain the phenomenon. This is going to be important when I try to rehabilitate final cause in modern biology later on in the series. But for now, it doesn't need to bother us much. It's just sort of an introduction to the history of causation, because what happened after Aristotle is that modern philosophers rejected his four causes as a sort of a medieval remnant of ancient philosophy. They retained only something like the efficient cause, like I already said, and that's very important, Aristotle's classic distinction between knowledge and belief. So for Aristotle, knowledge is justified true belief, and the way you justify your true belief is, for example, in the case of scientific knowledge, because you provide a necessary connection between a cause and its effect. So that this connection has to be there for there to be a cause and an effect. Okay, and this is highly problematic, this idea. But it stuck around. And the next sort of really big philosopher who was worried about causation, had a problem, a huge problem with causation, is David Hume. We've encountered him when we talked about perspectivism, and then again when we talked about absolute knowledge and the problem of induction. So David Hume had a particular definition of causation. Here he writes in his Inquiry Regarding Human Understanding, we may define a cause to be an object followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. Okay, let's go slowly. Let's do this again. We may define a cause to be an object followed by another. So one thing after another, if that makes sense. Where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So it's a sequence of events that always happens, basically, right? So this is called a regularity approach to causation. But remember the problem of induction, Hume's own problem of induction. How can you infer from one event always happening after another event in your experience to the fact that in the future it will always happen after that event as well? This is what you want when you have a causal explanation. You want it to be general, but then you run into the problem of induction. So how can you come up with an explanation? Okay, so for Hume, he was saying habit alone makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. So this is the essence of a regularity theory of causation. It's a habit of thinking for Hume. Hume was very pessimistic about our ability to empirically investigate the causal structure of the world. He said, it's just, we are getting used to stuff that always happens, it happens again, and then we, assume that it's going to happen in the future. That sums up in a rather lightweight way, the regularity theory of causation. Okay, so, but the problem is, and this is Hume's central problem here, we cannot determine a necessary connection between cause and effect, as Aristotle wanted us to do. So here goes Aristotle's sort of demarcation principle to distinguish science from non-scientific knowledge. And that was a big deal at the time in the 18th century. Okay, but the world has moved on. And it's interesting, before we move on, to sort of look at this quote again. Hume's quote has a little addendum at the end. So he sneaks in another theory of causation in the same quote, because the end of the quote says, in other words, it's not in other words, it's something different that he says right now, where if the first object had not been, the second never had existed. Now that's a different concept of causation. We're going to come back to that. So if the first object had not been, the second would never have existed. Okay, in the meantime, causation remained mysterious. Hume's sort of contemporary, almost contemporary, Kant, among other people, said, everybody thought, the problem is causation is a very sort of basic concept, right? It's difficult to explain because you need it in any sort of explanation that you come up with. So it's sort of, it's difficult to explain causation without using causation in the explanation itself. So Kant said causality is prior to human understanding. It's an a priori type of knowledge, and just like space and time in his philosophy. Okay, so it's something we just have to take for granted. Other philosophers went to even greater extremes, like Alfred North Whitehead, who said causality is prior to space and time. It's the first thing we need to be able to reason at all. And funnily enough, at around the time he was thinking that and writing that, physics, the special theory of relativity of Minkowski's derivation of space and time, actually proved him right, because Minkowski used causality to construct the very idea of space and time. So causality is this mysterious backbone of the universe. It's so fundamental that we can't explain it. And that's a problem. Well, people tried throughout the 20th century to explain it anyway. And one way to explain it brings us back to our old friend Carl Gustav Hempel and his covering law account of explanation in science. And so Hempel writes in his 1965 book, Aspects of Scientific Explanation, he writes that causal claims imply some corresponding regularity, a law linking cause to effect. So he picks up a very human way of seeing causality. And humans' habit becomes a law in Hempel's philosophy. So you only have a scientific explanation if you manage to subsume the phenomenon under a covering law, remember. It's a deductive argument where you deduce the phenomenon that you're looking at logically from a wider law. That's why it's called the deductive nomological model. And a central sort of ingredient of that is this sort of regularity treatment of causation. So other people disagreed with this very strict view that you needed laws for explanation. One of the first ones to do so was Wesley Salmon, another philosopher of the 20th century, who said scientific explanation means to show how a phenomenon fits into the causal nexus of the world. You don't need a law. It just needs to fit into the causal nexus of the world. He was accused of being a little vague here, and that's true. But physicists, for example, would interpret this as causes, for example, have to be associated with a transfer or matter of energy in physics. They have to be associated with something that we consider real. And that is what is called the ontological account of causation. So we have sort of a shift from regularity accounts based on laws from Hempel to an ontological account of causation in the writings of Salmon. But the problem is, okay, there are several problems here. So in biology, we neither have laws in general, nor do we have a very simple sort of transfer of matter or energy in physics. Think about the problem of a gene causing something very complicated again. So here, our old friend, the gay gene, which is supposed to sort of influence behavior of the organism, but it doesn't do this through a transfer of matter or energy. In fact, it does this, people think, through a transfer of information. That's a very problematic concept, as I've already mentioned. So we'll revisit that in the next lecture. What is that? But okay, genes cause stuff to happen, not in any way that fits into a regularity or ontological interpretation of causation. So this account of causation doesn't work. So was Alex Rosenberg right in the end? We don't have any causal explanations in biology? I don't think so. So we need a different account of causation. And by the way, people are, so these different accounts are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So the regularity account or the ontological account, they can apply in many, many ways, in physics, for example, but they rarely apply in biology. So we need a different view, a different perspective on causation here. So again, these perspectives, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they also don't necessarily just simply add up or complement each other very nicely. They're different. And so here's a different and very powerful account of causation in biology. And it was first proposed by David Lewis in 1973. It's exactly as old as I am. And it's a counterfactual account of causation, it's called. Why is it called that way? That sounds really funny. It's called that way because it's based on a type of proposition that's called a counterfactual conditional. Okay, so it is a sentence of the type, if X had not occurred, Y would not have occurred. That's exactly what Hume said in that second part of his quote. So this also goes back to Hume. And it shows you that it's, Hume packs two very different accounts of causality into that one sentence there, or two sentences. So this is a counterfactual because it talks about a world that is not real, a possible world, in which X, we have to clarify here that X and Y are events, okay? They're called in the theory of causation, the causal relata. In this case, they are events. So event X, if it doesn't occur, Y doesn't occur. That's not a real occasion. We see Y occurring. We want to explain why Y occurs, right? So we're making a counterfactual claim here to explain why Y occurs in the real world. It's kind of mind-boggling, but it's really interesting, this account. So here is Lewis writing, we think of a cause as something that makes a difference, and the difference it makes must be a difference from what would have happened without it in a possible world, not the actual world. He developed a really weird philosophy, ontology of possible worlds called modal realism. He believed that all these possible worlds are real, but we don't have to go into this. It's something that really fascinates me. But so what is important here is that causes are difference makers. The central point in this account, in a counterfactual theory of causation, a cause is a difference maker. If it would not occur, its effect would not occur. That's quite intuitively plausible. It's just the whole metaphysics behind it gets really weird. Okay, Lewis developed this theory further because there's a problem if there are multiple causes or different causes over time. So he defined this idea, this notion of a causal chain that can be a finite sequence of events. And he generalized his idea of X being a cause of Y. And then he said X can cause Y indirectly via intermediary events. So X, there could be several steps in between, and X would still count as a cause of Y, as long as if X doesn't occur, Y will not occur. And then he ran into all kinds of problems. People were criticizing him. There's problems with this account. One is called preemption. I'm not going to go into these problems, but there were problems. So he generalized the account and made it more specific, and that's important for what comes next. Okay, so he, in the year 2000, he published a paper where he introduced the idea of causal influence. And that idea, here is a very long quote, I'll read it out, is that event X influences event Y if and only if there is a substantial range, X1, X2, etc., of different not too distant alterations of X. And there is a range, Y1, Y2, etc., of alterations of Y, at least some of which differ from each other, such that if X1 had occurred, Y1 would have occurred, and if X2 had occurred, Y2 would have occurred, and so on. So instead of just having, okay, event happens or not, you have different versions of the event causing different versions of the effect, okay? And there is a sort of a regular relationship between the two, which he calls causal influence. The advantage of this more sophisticated theory of causation is it solves some of the problems that the previous theory had, but it's also more precise because it sort of accounts for the fact that there is a dependence not just on whether something occurs, but also when and how. Those are important aspects of causation. So this is as far as Lewis got, and more recently, philosopher James Woodward has developed this idea further into an account that directly links up to the practice of doing genetics in biology. And he calls this an interventionist framework for causation. And the basic idea is here is that causal relationships, unlike mere statistical correlations, can be exploited for purposes of manipulation and control. So you can manipulate the system and see what happens. This is what we do in genetics. We mutate an organism. So he asks the question, what is it for X to cause Y? Now I'm using capital X, capital Y. X causes Y if and only if there are background circumstances, B, such that if some single intervention that changes X and no other variable, so only X, were to occur, then Y, or the probability distribution of Y, would change. Oof, okay, let's parse this. The first important difference to note here is that this relates no longer single events called tokens, but variables, okay? So these variables can have all kinds of different values. So it's a class of a type of event, no longer a token event, a specific event. So it's a more general theory. Also, the background circumstances, okay, contextualizes this idea of causation, because those circumstances include everything that's not explicitly represented in the X and Y relationship, but it can include other causal factors. So Y can be the effect of other causes that are relevant to Y happening. Okay, doesn't have to be, but it can include those. And this notion of an intervention, this is very important in this theory. It's an idealized experimental manipulation of X which causes a change in Y. And this is closely related to the neo-mechanistic account of explanation, because it assumes that you can identify clearly distinguishable components, variables that you can isolate and then manipulate, independent of the rest of the system. We'll see in just 2 more lectures how we run into problems in organisms with that. But as a first sort of a starter, it's a pretty clear concept, the concept of intervention. So Woodward generalizes Lewis's theory in a way and makes it more specific in another way by making it depend on manipulations, interventions. So let's look at a quick example here. We have a population of fruit flies in a bottle in the lab, and some of them have red eyes and some of them have white eyes. The red-eyed flies are wild type, the white-eyed flies are white mutants. And these drawings are from an actual genetics paper from Muller in 1930, beautiful drawings. So now you want to explain the difference between the 2 eye colors, and you check what is differing across this population. So to come up with the difference maker, the cause for eye color here, you have to study a population of flies. That's very important. So what we're talking about, actual difference makers, are a property of a population of individuals. And so This is from a paper by Ken Waters in 2007, and he writes, so an actual difference maker is identified by the same interventionist approach that Woodward is proposing. So X causes Y in the sense of Woodward, but also Y has to vary across a population or over time. So there is nothing to explain if all flies have the same color of an eye. Well, is there? The relation X causes Y remains invariant across all values of Y. So let's look at the white gene here that was used by Morgan and his genetics group as an explanation. It is causing both the red eye color and the white eye color by being in different forms, right? So that's important. And the last condition is variation in X accounts for variation in Y. If not all, then at least a substantial amount of the variation. There could be other factors that are less important. Actually, in biology, in most cases, there are. We'll come back to that. Okay, so these are the four sort of characteristics of an actual difference maker. Now, so the first thing to remember is that this is a population level sort of idea, but the other thing is that there are potential difference makers as well if there's an actual difference makers. Morgan's lab, they knew of at least 20-something different eye color variants in Drosophila. So they knew that there were other factors affecting eye color, but in this particular population that we had before, there were only white-eyed and red-eyed flies. So all these other genes that are implied in other colored phenotypes are potential difference makers in this specific case. And what Waters is arguing in his paper is that geneticists are not interested in what if questions. They are very pragmatic people. They have a population of flies. They want to explain exactly what's happening in that population. And that's what a classical genetic explanation is all about. So we use these actual difference makers because we pick them out from other causes, because they are what's actually varying in the population. So Drosophila eye color, by the way, is influenced by all kinds of other things. For example, the eye not growing. There's a problem with eye color. If there's no eye color. So growth processes, metabolism. But these sort of influences are not what's actually varying in the population that you're looking at. And also the other genes, the other potential mutants is not what's varying. So you identify, you pick out that particular gene as a cause because it's the actual difference maker in this particular case. So you're not interested in any sort of regularity based explanation or causality. It's a specific, it's an idea of causality that applies to one specific set of circumstances. Okay, so I hope that's more or less clear. I mean, it seems obvious, right? But I mean, there's some interesting ways in which you can take this further. So Woodward has a beautiful paper in 2010 in which he powerfully extends his framework with three sort of features that help us distinguish between causal relationships. So now we're no longer interested in distinguishing causation from correlation, but we're trying to classify different types of causes and characterize them in different ways. And so one feature of causal interactions is their stability, okay? This is easy. It's also called non-contingency, insensitivity, or invariance. And it's basically just a causal relationship is stable if the range of circumstances B over which it remains invariant is large. Okay, it's a relative term, but the larger this sort of domain over which it is invariant, the more stable the interaction is. You can have interactions that are very context dependent, and those are not stable. Okay, so that's sort of a measure of, again, regularity, but you can have causes that are not regular here, but those that are very stable are probably very irregularly occurring in nature, right? So it connects back to the regularity account of causation, but it's broader than this. We see that. So again, it sort of connects up to the idea that a general law is just a very broad model, right? It goes hand in hand with that sort of account of scientific explanation that we had earlier on. Okay, the second feature of causal relationships is their proportionality. So are we at the appropriate level of explanation? And you can imagine two scenarios. A causal explanation can be inappropriately broad if it includes irrelevant detail, or it can be overly narrow if it fails to include relevant detail. So we want to have just the right kind of explanation with just enough detail, not too complicated, not too simple. I think It's not a real quote, but somebody said, Einstein said, you should simplify your problem as much as you can, but not more than that. So that's sort of the point here. And then the last, the most important feature, also the difficult to understand, is that of causal specificity. Okay, and it's directly related to Lewis' concept of causal influence. Let me help you with a drawing here. So let's imagine you have abstract representations of a variable with different values, x1, x2, x3, etc., and variable effect variable y, y1, y2, y3, etc. And so they have a certain relationship. And so if you have a specific relationship, that relationship should be coming in the form, or at least approximately in the form, of a mathematical function, which means it should be sort of dependable and regular and sort of always the same, right? It's a well-defined relationship, basically. The second sort of feature of specificity has something to do with how the values of the variables are linked together. So one other condition is that not too many variables in X should map to the same value in Y. So not too many causes should cause the same effect. Okay, so because otherwise there's not much to explain. And the most important feature of these sort of arrows is that every Y should have an X. Okay, it's called surjectivity of the mapping if you're into mathematics. So what that means is that we want to have ideally a one-to-one association of a value in X with a value of Y. This is called bijective mapping in mathematics. And so the more specific those interactions are, the more specific the causal influence. So to put this in words, X will influence Y to the extent that by varying the value of X and its time and place of occurrence, we can modulate Y in a fine-grained way. Or if you're into music, here is an example. You have two controls on your amplifier. One is the power button on the left. One is the volume knob, goes up to 11. And so which one is more specific, right? Which one has the more specific influence on the sound of your amplifier? Okay, the on-off switch, just two states, no sound or sound of a certain volume. And the volume button, of course, has a much more specific influence on the sound because you can tune its volume smoothly up and down. Okay, so the volume knob is specific, the on-off button is not. And what that means for the fly example, as Ken Waters already argues, is that if you have multiple possible causes for differences in eye color, you must pick out those causes that actually vary and are most specific. And of course, this is an argument for genetic reductionism. So Waters is saying here, geneticists are just doing what's reasonable if you take serious this Woodwardian account of interventionist causation. They pick out the genes, which are those causes that explain the actual variation in the population. And this is true. I fully agree with that. So now we have to take this situation and think about other circumstances. B, remember the set of circumstances B. How broadly is this applicable? What are the circumstances under which this applies? And what are the circumstances where it doesn't? And here is a circumstance where it doesn't. Look at it. So we had a very simple pathway to eye color, biochemical pathways, very simply, straightforwardly affected by single gene mutations. But what's happening here is that the effect of any single mutation in this huge network is no longer simple like that, okay? And it is not easy to pick out the specific causes in a network like this. So what we're gonna do in the next lecture is we're gonna connect back to these complicated underlying networks. And we're gonna have a look at how can you look at the flow of causation and the specificity of causation in such much more complicated traits that are influenced by many interacting genes. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in again next time. Bye now.